70 years ago, inside a small, quiet study in Omaha where the only sound was the rustle of newspaper pages, a young man sat with a pencil, calculating the inner worth of a world that was too busy to notice. Jesus stood by the wooden bookshelf, watching Warren, a focused, simple soul, ignoring the flashing lights of the ticker tape and the noise of the crowd. He wasn't just buying stocks. He was looking for seeds. He realized that wealth is not a sprint of greed, but a long, slow walk with the laws of nature. Back then, the world was a casino of fast talk and broken promises. People wanted to get rich by sunset, gambling on the shadows of things they didn't understand. But Warren, he was like a farmer who understood that the soil of integrity is where the true gold grows. He spent his days reading reports while others were chasing trends, finding the quiet strength in a Coca-Cola bottle or a simple brick, knowing that if you buy a business as if you were buying a farm, the rain will eventually come. He planted a seed that the speculators called boring, but the divine called it the virtue of patience. The skeptics laughed. Why aren't you in the new industries? Why are you holding on to the old ways? But Jesus smiled, because he knew the secret of the long view. To be a faithful steward of small things is the only way to be trusted with the treasures of the earth. He spent his nights obsessed with margin of safety, understanding that the price is what you pay, but the value is what you get. He lived in the same house for decades and ate the same simple meals, proving that the greatest empire is the one built on a foundation of character rather than excess. The desk was cluttered with manuals and the light was dim, but in that humble room, the Oracle of Omaha was already learning how to outlast the storms of a century. 40 years ago, on a snowy morning in the heart of the Great Plains, a small snowball began to roll down a slope that seemed to have no end. Jesus stood at the top of the hill, watching Warren add a single layer of ice and grit to his vision every single day. He wasn't looking for a big score or a lucky break. He was mastering the power of time. He realized that the universe rewards the one who is willing to wait, and that the greatest miracles are not born in a flash, but in the quiet repetition of decades. Back then, the world was addicted to the quick flip. Traders shouted on the floors of the exchange, buying at dawn and selling at noon, living in a fever of the next hour. But Warren? He was like a gardener who planted an oak tree and refused to dig it up to see if the roots were growing. He let the dividends flow back into the soil, turning cents into dollars, and dollars into millions, and millions into an empire of capital. He didn't need to be the smartest man in the room. He just needed to be the most disciplined man in the century. He planted a seed that the bankers called efficiency, but the divine called it the stewardship of accumulation. The critics grumbled, "He is too slow. The world is passing him by. He doesn't understand the new speed." But Jesus smiled because he knew the law of the harvest. A forest is not built by a storm, but by the persistent reaching of branches toward the sun year after year. He spent his nights obsessed with rationality, refusing to let the emotions of the market infect the clarity of his soul. He stayed in Omaha, far from the madness of Wall Street, knowing that the best decisions are made in the silence of one's own integrity. The snowball was small, and the progress was invisible to the naked eye, but in that steady motion, the flywheel of wealth was gaining a momentum that no force on earth could stop. 30 years ago, inside the quiet, wood-paneled office where no computer screen flickered, the only maps on the wall were the ones drawn in the mind of a man who loved durability. Jesus stood by the tall windows, watching Warren study the blueprints of a candy company and a local newspaper. He wasn't looking for the fastest engine or the shiniest toy. He was looking for a moat. He realized that in the kingdom of man, everything is under attack, and the only way to survive is to build a fortress of quality that time itself cannot erode. Back then, the world was chasing the new. Investors ran toward the bright, loud promises of technology that changed every season. But Warren? He was like a medieval mason who understood that the thickness of the wall matters more than the height of the banner. He looked for the economic moat, a brand that a child loves, a bridge that everyone must cross, or a secret recipe that can never be copied. He didn't want to own the future. He wanted to own the things that the future would never want to live without. He planted a seed that the market called antique, but the divine called it the recognition of substance. The headlines teased him. He is missing the tech boom. He is stuck in the 19th century. But Jesus smiled, because he knew the law of the foundation. A house built on the sand of hype will fall, but a house built on the rock of intrinsic value will stand when the floods come. He spent his nights obsessed with predictability, believing that if you cannot see what a business will look like in 20 years, you do not own a business, you own a lottery ticket. He chose simple products and honest managers, proving that the most powerful weapon in a world of complexity is the courage to stay simple. The balance sheets were long, and the newspapers were heavy. But in that steady analysis, the fortress of capital was being fortified by the stones of common sense. 20 years ago, inside the chaotic halls of the stock exchange where the air was thick with panic and red ink, the screens flickered like dying stars as the world watched its wealth evaporate. Jesus stood in the middle of the screaming traders, watching Warren sit quietly in his office thousands of miles away from the noise. He wasn't selling in a frenzy. He was waiting for the discounts of despair. He realized that the market is a bipolar machine that alternates between unearned euphoria and irrational terror. Back then, the world was a slave to the ticker tape. When the prices went up, people grew greedy and blind. When they fell, they grew hopeless and small. But Warren? He was like a sailor who used the storm to buy the ships that others were throwing overboard. He lived by a code that was simple to say but impossible for most to follow. Be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful. He didn't see a crisis. He saw a world where the best businesses were finally on sale. He knew that the sun would rise again, even when the rest of the world was convinced it was the end of days. He planted a seed that the panicking masses called insanity. But the divine called it the temperament of the just. The brokers yelled into their phones, "The sky is falling!" Everything is over, but Jesus smiled, because he knew the spirit of the anchor. To remain unmoved when the world is shaking is the ultimate form of mastery. He spent his nights obsessed with margin of safety, knowing that if you buy $1 for 50 cents, time is your greatest ally. He ignored the television pundits and the gossip of the streets, proving that your emotional bank account is more important than your brokerage statement. The phone was ringing, and the headlines were bleeding, but in that resolute silence, the oracle was proving that the greatest asset a man can own is his own mind. 10 years ago, inside a bustling steakhouse where the air was warm with the scent of coffee and conversation, the world's most expensive lunch was being served to those who sought the light of experience. Jesus stood at the edge of the booth, watching Warren lean in, sharing secrets not of math but of life. He wasn't teaching them how to read a balance sheet. He was teaching them how to read a soul. He realized that wealth is only a tool, and that the greatest return on investment is the lives you touch with your wisdom. Back then, the world measured success by the height of the mountain one stood upon alone. We thought that keeping the gold was the only way to stay powerful. But Warren, he was like a king who decided that his crown belonged to the people. He pledged his billions to the giving pledge, turning the snowball of capital into a river of grace. He understood that a man cannot take his bank account into the eternity, but he can send his influence ahead of him through the hunger he feeds and the diseases he helps cure. He chose to live simply so that others might simply live. He planted a seed that the greedy called waste, but the divine called it the multiplication of the loaves. The skeptics whispered, "Why give it all away? Why not build a monument to your own name?" But Jesus smiled, because he knew the freedom of the open hand. The more you give away of what you do not need, the more room you have for what truly matters. He spent his nights obsessed with legacy, knowing that your reputation is the only thing you truly own at the end of the day. He became the teacher to 1,000 students and the conscience of 1,000,000 investors, proving that the most valuable asset is the trust people place in your word. The steak was simple and the laughter was loud, but in that shared meal, the oracle was proving that the ultimate wealth is the gratitude of the world. 30 years ago, inside a courtroom filled with the cold shadows of scandal and the weight of betrayal, the reputation of a financial empire was crumbling like dry sand. Jesus stood behind the witness stand, watching Warren lean into the microphone, his voice steady as an old bell. He wasn't there to hide the rot or protect the guilty. He was there to offer the sacrifice of integrity. He realized that a business without a soul is just a hollow shell, and that the most expensive thing in the world is a lie. Back then, the world was a theater of clever maneuvers and hidden fine print. When things went wrong, leaders pointed fingers and buried the truth in layers of legal ink. But Warren, he was like a man who walked into a burning building just to save the word trust. He told his employees and the world, "Lose money for the firm and I will be understanding. Lose a shred of reputation for the firm and I will be ruthless." He didn't hire the most expensive PR firms. He simply offered the naked, unvarnished truth. He planted a seed that the cynical called naivety, but the divine called it the armor of the upright. The lawyers whispered, "Don't say too much. You'll be liable. You'll lose everything." But Jesus smiled, because he knew the strength of the bedrock. When the storm of scandal blows, the only thing left standing is the man who has nothing to hide. He spent his nights obsessed with character, knowing that you cannot make a good deal with a bad person. He built a culture where the inner scorecard mattered more than the world's applause, proving that being right is more important than being rich. The cameras were flashing and the judges were stern, but in that moment of confession, the oracle was proving that honesty is the only currency that never devalues. Today, in the golden silence of a study where the clock ticks with the steady rhythm of a century well lived, the man who bought the world is finally ready to let it go. Jesus stands by the worn leather chair, watching Warren look out the window at the simple trees of Nebraska. He isn't thinking about the stock price of Apple or the dividends of a bank anymore. He is thinking about the compounding of the soul. He realized that at the end of the long slope, the only thing that doesn't melt away is the love you gave and the integrity you kept. Back then, we thought the point of the game was to reach the highest number on the scoreboard. We thought the winner was the one who collected the most toys before the lights went out. But Warren, he is the one who proved that the greatest investment is the person you become. He lived in the same house for 70 years while he built a fortune for millions, showing us that a man's worth is not measured by the size of his palace, but by the depth of his peace. He didn't just accumulate capital. He accumulated the trust of a generation. He planted a seed that the history books will call the Berkshire era, but the divine called it the mastery of enough. The world asks, who will replace him? What happens when the oracle is gone? But Jesus smiles, because he knew the secret of the harvest. The best crops don't just feed the hungry, they leave behind the seeds for 1,000 more seasons. For this final chapter, Warren stands as the grandfather of the global market. He is the boy who delivered newspapers and ended by delivering a philosophy of life. He is the billionaire who proved that you can reach the top without ever losing your way or your sense of humor. He knew one thing: success is being loved by the people you want to be loved by. In the quiet glow of the evening, as the sun dips below the Great Plains, the gears of eternal value start to click with the heartbeat of a man who is content. The ledger is balanced. The work is finished. And Warren sits in the stillness, a man who taught the world that the most powerful thing you can do with a long life is to remain a student of the truth. The snowball has reached the bottom of the hill, but in the silence of Omaha, the mountain of his character remains unshakable and bright.